Hello and welcome to another episode of the AgCulture Podcast. I'm Paul Windemuller, host of the AgCulture Podcast, and today I'm continuing my journey through New Zealand. I am on the North Island this time, and I'm going to be speaking with a friend of mine who I'm staying with, Ben Anderson, who traveled in my Nuffield group as we traveled around for about 6 weeks back in early 2024 through North America and Europe. And I always enjoyed hearing his insights that he had as a New Zealand farmer. And we're going to dig into his story a little bit on this episode, but also into the region that he farms and the region that I'm sitting today. Ben and his wife, Amanda, were kind enough to host us for a couple of days here as we traveled through this region. And we're going to be taking a look at several farms. So if you're interested in following along and seeing some of the pictures and videos that we took in this region, check out our social media pages on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and you can see some of the pictures from our time here. Now, Ben's a pretty humble guy, so he didn't mention this in the episode, but he is well involved in agriculture here in New Zealand, writing several articles. He's a writing contributor to agricultural publications here in New Zealand, and Ben has a pretty unique story about how they got involved in agriculture. So we're going to start out there and then discuss what's unique to this region of New Zealand that we're sitting in today. So I hope you enjoy this episode with Ben Anderson. I just want to say a big thank you to today's episode sponsor, SDG Precision Ag, your trusted partner in precision farming. As your local ag leader dealer, SDG Precision Ag offers full farm cutting-edge technology to optimize yields and improve efficiency. Trust SDG Precision Ag, an ag leader, to elevate your farming operation. Learn more at sdgprecisionag.com. So, Ben Anderson, thank you so much for having me on your farm today here. And where are we exactly in New Zealand?
We are just out of a place called Onga Onga, which is in the central Hawke's Bay of the North Island of New Zealand. So we are right under the Ruahine Ranges, which is quite a cool part of the world. And we're probably a good hour's drive to the coast. So in about an hour from an airport, so it's not a bad spot to be.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful spot. We're here in the summertime and really enjoying seeing a lot of the agriculture around here. It's pretty diverse compared to some other parts of New Zealand for what you have for agriculture around here. So I thought that'd be a great opportunity for you to share what goes on in this region of New Zealand. And let's start out by talking about your story, because you have a pretty unique story getting involved in agriculture. You kind of started out as a kid, right? And then had a career, or started your career in a different aspect.
Yeah, I did, mate. And I think it probably was quite unique, but in some ways it's possibly not. So I started out sheep and beef farming in a place called the King Country, which is on the other side of the North Island, to be fair, probably a good 3 hours drive away. And that was a very remote location, surrounded by bush. And it was a great place to grow up. But I think equally it was, we weren't making a lot of dough. And to me at the time, farming, well, I really enjoyed the outside component of it. I didn't either love the money, nor did it probably provide the excitement that I really wanted at the time. So I actually went down the military route, and I spent the first 10 years of my life within the New Zealand Army, travelling overseas a lot, and then I went into what we called the private security sector. So I started working in Afghanistan in the middle of the Middle East, doing private security consulting, risk management, crisis management, emergency management, that kind of thing. And then with a little bit of a side track into munitions clearance, explosive remnants of war clearance in Cambodia and Vietnam, and working in Africa and places like the Danakil Depression. And yeah, it was pretty neat. But then we started having kids, and I thought maybe it was time to grow up. And
being around explosives all the time probably wasn't the best thing for having kids.
No, but it was good. But it was quite similar to deer farming. And so there was a few similarities, man. There was risk management 101 all through it. But But I might have said it before, but I think that someone asked me what I did before I went farming, and I said, I used to be a risk management consultant. They said, man, you must have been really bad if you thought it was a good idea to go farming. So anyway, here we are.
And you started out originally deer farming, right?
Yeah, correct. So we bought this farm as a going concern with velvet stags. So we were running around 350 velvet stags plus replacement stock. So for those of your listeners that don't know, deer farming in New Zealand has two basic streams. You could be doing a focus on venison, which is obviously the meat, or you could be doing a focus on the velvet, in which case you still get a byproduct of the venison. But the velvet market, we did export primarily to Asia. So about 2/3 of that would go into China and about another third would go into South Korea. And that ratio is largely still the same. So we did that, and then we decided this block was a little bit small, and we decided therefore we wanted to get into dairy as well and diversify a little bit more. And at that point there, it actually made sense to convert this block to dairy support, which is what I do here now. And I run my R2s, R1, R2 replacement heifers on this block with a little bit of wintering support as well.
Yeah. And then what was it, about 3 years ago, you took on the dairy?
Yeah.
So what was that venture like getting into that?
Mate, it was drinking through a fire hydrant, I think. It's look, I don't think anyone ever accused me of not having a crack at things, but but sometimes you don't know what you don't know. But look, it made a lot of sense, right? There was two drivers that were going on for us at the time. The first of which was that velvet it has always been quite a volatile market, but it was increasingly so at the time that we made the decision to buy the dairy, and there was a real attraction to a more solid value chain that sat behind the dairy industry, and that point still absolutely remains. I'm very comfortable with the decision to do that and to jump in with Fonterra as part of that. And I think also another decision in terms of the geographic location of where we bought that farm, being down near Kitahuna. Look, it's not everyone's key place to want to go dairy farming, but for us, it had a good, reliable rainfall, and that was also important to us at the time, being in Central Hawke's Bay. So diversifying our farming assets and our risk was a key part of that.
Yeah. And another way you guys have diversified a couple of the properties is in the forestry sector as well, right?
Yeah, correct. Absolutely. So being inherently lazy, like I am, I thought it was quite a good idea to have forestry in there too. You know, other than establishment, there's not too much that can go wrong. Well, there is, to be fair. You can have fire and you can have pests and stuff like that. So there's absolutely risk associated with it. But for us, it was we felt that forestry supported by, and this is plantation forestry with a timber focus, not permanent carbon forestry. But we felt that offered a really nice diversification to our land asset portfolio. And whilst it doesn't provide a great cash flow for the first 4 or 5 years, after that point it does. So mixing those two asset classes together seemed to us to make good sense, and I'm still pretty happy with that decision.
Yeah, it suits some of the country that you have that was a little bit more difficult to farm and probably was more susceptible to erosion if it was grazed pretty heavily with heavier stock as well.
Yeah, 100%. And I think we, as a nation, we're still grappling a little bit with the place of trees.
Yeah, go into that a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm always keen to start a fight, man. But I'm a hill country farmer, I suppose. And look, forestry in New Zealand is really contentious. We've seen a significant increase, to be fair, more recently in the plantation of Pinus radiata, and that is to been at the detriment, some would argue, to sheep and beef farming. So you're seeing some sheep and beef farms being converted into forestry. And that plays out, right? Because culturally, we might think that sheep and beef farming is what this land should be, particularly in the Hawke's Bay. We've been doing it for, 150 years, and our poor fathers cleared the land from scrub and bush and put it into that. And so isn't that what we should be doing? If you're going to be a good farmer, that's a good idea to maintain that legacy. So anytime you look at it and you go, well, actually, is there actually another type of land use that we could consider for that land? That's always going to draw spirited conversation. And, look, I think there's a lot of ins and outs in it, but my feeling is that any land use should first and foremost be economic. It should be good for the environment. And it should and it should also present a diversified form of income for the economy. Mm-hmm. And so I think if we're all sheep and beef, I'd be concerned. Equally, I'd be concerned if we're all forestry. So for us, it's about trying to find a balance in terms of how we use our land and in what manner. And I'm still pretty keen on forestry, but I wouldn't do it solely.
And there is, again, like the deer industry, there is kind of two different avenues that you can take with it. And that there's one that's probably a little bit more contentious than the other, where you guys are doing plantation style farming, where forestry, where you're planning on taking it as a crop. And then there's the aspect, the other avenue that you could take of just putting it into permanent forestry and not planning on getting a harvest off of that or really doing anything with the land once it's established?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And look, it's a good point of distinction. So our focus is very much on planting pine in the location where it could be harvested. And for us, that means it needs to be probably within 100 kilometres of port. So that reduces the cartage. Yep. And also it needs to be in land which is not really difficult to extract from, and are not places whereby it will actually cause issues that will fall into gullies and ravines and get washed down and wipe out bridges and that kind of thing. We've certainly seen that going on in places like Gisborne, further up the coast from where we are. I think also there is a distinction in terms of if you plant the trees from what we call permanent forestry, where it would be there essentially indefinitely, and you'd be drawing carbon return from that. But the challenge with that is that it becomes Pinus radiata, that after a period of time, you cease to be able to achieve carbon from it, and then you've got trees occupying land, and they provide nothing really more than the nuisance factor. Mm-hmm. And that is a real concern. And so for that reason, I'm not super supportive of permanent Pinus radiata planting, even if potentially maybe in the long run it may convert back to indigenous forest, but it's a pretty long bow to draw, I believe.
Yeah. So we talked about deer, we talked about dairy, we talked about forestry. You mentioned this was a traditional sheep and beef country originally. What are some of the other aspects of agriculture that are kind of unique to this region?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because this area here has been very much on the lowlands. You've seen cropping. On the hill country, you've seen sheep and beef and a scattering of deer farms as well. But I think that what we're seeing now is a warming of the climate, and you're actually starting to see a lot more of the horticulture that would traditionally be grown an hour up the road is becoming closer and closer. So we've had a really big horticulture development going just down the road from us right now, and it's probably one of the biggest ones in Australasia. So, and that's largely focusing on apples and grapes.
Yeah.
And so we're starting to see increased diversification, but the limit behind it is always going to be water. And I guess that's a common theme anywhere at the moment, isn't it? Doesn't matter whether in the Middle East or America or Australia, of course. But for here, it's the big conversation, and so it can be a major inhibitor. So how we manage our water resource, which is also contentious, but ultimately it'd be nice to see us being able to support a growing, changing climate with the appropriate water resource to make it effective. And if we could do that from a regional development perspective, even better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you see opportunities in this region for further development to add value to products that you're growing that are really just raw commodities getting shipped out right now? Is that something that there is much processing in this area? What's that look like?
No, you're touching on my favourite topic.
That's why I touched on it. I knew it'd trigger a conversation.
Yeah. No, we're into it now. But
and that's kind of what you did your Nuffield on originally, right?
Yeah, I did. So my Nuffield was largely on the monetisation of environmental sustainability. And I think from that, New Zealand has been really good at producing raw commodities. Mm-hmm. For a long time, we were, the UK's market garden in the bottom of the South Pacific, and that suited us well as it suited the UK. But then we had the UK merge into EU, and then we had the come off of subsidies in New Zealand in the 80s, and it's been a dramatically different landscape. And sheep and beef farming has been difficult. Dairy has had ebbs and flows. It's still stronger. But by and large, we still process and export raw, undifferentiated commodity products overseas. That's pretty much our business. Mm-hmm. And there are people that are doing it differently, and we are adding value in different ways, and we are capturing market power in different ways. And I think there's absolutely more ability for us to, there's certainly more potential for us to achieve that going forward. In fact, there's tremendous potential. But I think we need to be really clear as a country about what our competitive or comparative advantage is.
Yep.
Look, I think we've got to stop probably going away from the thinking that, we're a really efficient farmer, or we're really just really good at producing food, and let's just keep doing that. But look, there are other places in the world that are really, really good at producing food. And so, that's not necessarily our comparative advantage. And so what is? And maybe it's our natural landscapes. Maybe it's the fact that we have a really strong tourist sector, and maybe there's opportunity there to add to that. Maybe there's also significant potential to add to our commodities, whether it's timber or otherwise. We're probably, in terms of comparative advantage, we grow timber as well as anywhere in the world, and I think there's only one place in the world that grows it faster than us. So, how can we capture that comparative advantage, and how can we do downstream processing to support that? So, long way of saying, 100%. There's a lot we can do, but we really just need to be clear-eyed about what it is and then get after it.
What are some of the aspects that you've looked at from your Nuffield that you took home with you out of your research that you did?
I think every time I go overseas or I talk to other people, there's always a degree of humility that steps into it, because you realise you're never quite as good as you think you are.
Yeah.
And I think that is always the biggest takeaway. And I was never smarter, more intelligent or witty than when I was in my early 20s. And it's just, I've just regressed.
I think I peaked at probably 17 or 18. So you're doing
exactly. I was a late bloomer. But I think, it is that sense of humility. You go over to the States and you get a massive sense of scale. I didn't get to Brazil, but talking to people that did, you get a sense of their ability to produce. I mean, who would have thought triple cropping? Their ability to produce on scale, even without chemicals, biological controls, that's far outstripping anything we're doing at the moment. So it's good to have a degree of national pride, but you need to be clear-eyed about what's happening outside, particularly when you're playing in the international market. Then you need to be really clear about what your competitors are doing.
Yeah.
And you can't rest on your laurels at all. And so I think that, to answer your question more accurately, what do I learn? Well, I learned that there's a lot of people doing some really clever stuff in the environmental side, and the downstream processing side, and the branding side. And there's an awful lot we can keep on learning. And we're just going to have to work a lot harder to stay competitive, let alone at the head of the pack. And I think that's the biggest thing. So we need to have and New Zealand has finite resources. So the sooner we really work out what our comparative advantage is, how we're going to be competitive, and concentrate your resources in the pursuit of that, the better off we're going to be.
Yeah.
So that's probably the biggest takeaway.
What are some of the regional challenges outside of what you were talking about before, trying to add value to the raw commodities being produced in this area? What are some of the regional challenges, maybe politically or environmentally or economically, that growers face in this region in New Zealand?
Look, I think the strategy piece is there, being clear-eyed about what we want to do, but then I think there's the financial piece that sits underneath that. How do we harness the financial resources to take that next step in what we want to do, whether that's technology or infrastructure development, all those sort of things. I think we also need to be rational and objective about when we put in resource consents for timber production or something like that. We need to be supportive of what we're trying to do in the longer term, rather than looking at focusing on short-term impediments. The cost of power is another major one. Power in New Zealand is really expensive. How can we generate power more cost effectively and more reliably?
And most of that right now is generated through hydro dams.
Yeah, it is. Look, and we're probably, as a nation, we're probably rightly quite proud of the how green our energy production is. But it's also comes with a fluctuating environment. When you've got hydro dams, then that also provides you peaks. And so how do you balance that out? Supported by good, technology to transfer that power. And, dare I say it, maybe actually we do need to look at nuclear as an example. It's been a taboo topic in New Zealand for a long period of time, ever since, we got our ship sunk by a rogue French agent in the Auckland harbour. We've been thinking about nuclear energy as the boogeyman, and we often tie that up with nuclear weapons, and we confuse the conversation with nuclear weapons with nuclear energy generation. And I think probably a good idea to have a conversation around that too.
Yep. Yep. Well, that's very insightful.
Yeah. I think climate change is probably a big one for us too. I think that, we have a conversation around what, we can look at climate change and from a farming perspective, first of all, it's not happening. And then, okay, maybe it is happening, but we're not doing it. Or, it's a natural phenomenon or whatever it happens to be, right? And, but I think the conversation that we really need to be having is how is climate change actually affecting our operating environment? And how can we reduce the risk and maximise the opportunity that a changing environment poses to us?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a big thing, because I just think that farming it comes back to my previous life about risk management. And maybe I didn't make the best decision of buying a farm, but now that I have, how do we progress the opportunity and manage the risk going forward? And so I think about, look, we've actually got a wealth of climate change data and projections in terms of what the climate's going to be like going forward. But how many of us are actually thinking about it and acting on it with the future in mind, and then taking advantage of the opportunities that might bring?
Yeah.
And I mean that from an individual farm owner perspective, but I mean it from a government perspective and a regional planning perspective, because it is such an important driver.
Yes.
And like, no one wants a climate that's unlivable, but in the reality is it is changing. So, and we need to ask ourselves the question, so what? And so, and it may well mean that actually there's a whole host of opportunities that come out of that, as well as a whole host of risks that if we don't manage it, then we could get sunk. Right. So, it's over to us what we do with it. Right?
You want to talk a little bit about land use consent and how that's looked upon, not only in this region, but in New Zealand as general? That's something I haven't really touched on yet as I've been going around New Zealand, but been hearing a lot about it, especially from a dairy perspective.
Yeah, look, I wouldn't profess to be a full expert on consent processes, but we certainly we do need to apply for resource consent to do different things within farming. I guess it would be similar in other parts of the world, but for example, if we wanted to be a dairy farmer, we must have a consent to use the land for dairy production. Equally, if you're in what we call a high-risk catchment area where you've got a high level of nitrates in the waterways, then you would even need to apply for a resource consent to farm, full stop. And so all that costs a lot of money and time. So, yeah, look, it is relatively restrictive. And you could argue that for good reason. But I think that we would do well to make our system as streamlined and cost-effective as we can, because I would stress the need for agility. And if your regulatory frameworks are not agile and can't keep up with rapid decision-making, then they're probably not going to be fit for purpose. So, as much as I said that we need to be clear-eyed about what we want to do and where we want to go, then that needs to be supported by a bureaucratic system that is equally agile.
Yep.
The biggest thing that I'd like to be able to see New Zealand farmers achieve, and I think it's also farmers right around the world, because, as we've travelled through Texas and Ireland and Germany, and, you've been through a range of other countries, that it's the same old problem. We seem to be always be at that price taker level for the better part. There are exceptions to the rule, but by and large, that's where we sit. And I think, you asked earlier about what a takeaway is. I said, man, we always just seem to be sitting at that peasant level. And, we've got a lot of money tied up. But a lot of risk, and we don't have the return. So the return is not commensurate to the risk. And I think it's high time, as owners of the lands, that we finally worked out and got smart enough to capture a level of return that is commensurate to the level of risk that we accept. And I think that is probably the biggest thing we really need to start getting our head around. And what is really pleasing to see is models out there of people that are actually finding ways of capturing market power to ensure that they are starting to get that level of return. Because there's money in food, but this is we're not necessarily achieving it. And I'll give you an example of that. Within the dairy industry, our dairy velvet that we export, if you do a value spread analysis, we get 3% of the end value. And I'm pretty sure that meat that gets exported, we get about 12, which is pretty good. So the value is there. It's just that we're not capturing it. And so how do we do that? We don't necessarily want to try and take over all the logistics functions or the processing functions that get our food to the end consumer. But how can we capture and maintain a degree of market power to ensure that we're getting a fair return for what it is that we do?
Yep.
And there are ways of doing it, whether it's cooperatives or whether it's brands or whether it's direct consumer models. Every approach is going to be different, but the opportunity exists. And so, it would be really, really cool to see if we can actually start capturing that more fully and working together to do it. Yeah.
And I think one example I'd be interested to talk about from your perspective as a Fonterra shareholder, Fonterra is a very large business, right? So it's brought back a lot of value, taking a raw product of milk and putting it into base ingredients that get shipped offshore, get exported. Most of their product is exported. But it's become such a big business. How do you propose in a situation like that? Is it possible for a business like Fonterra to really create a lot more value beyond just changing the form of a product like that? Is that what you're talking about? Or are you talking about trying to really create large brands that have market presence all over the world with the consumer, maybe not necessarily a B2B model, but a B2C model?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, right? And we're sitting on two different sides. Ultimately we're competitors, aren't we?
Right.
So, but I think if we're going to compete with you guys, and look, take everything I say with a pinch of salt. I'm 3 years into my my shareholding, and there's some very experienced dairy farmers out there, and who have been involved with Fonterra and other cooperatives for a long time. So, note that with my comments. But what I do know is that I was talking to a business a wee while ago who weathered COVID exceptionally well, who are an exporter of finished food products and unfinished. And the director of the business said to me, our secret sauce is multiple distribution channels and multiple markets. So if you're a one-trick pony, you have to be aware that that may come down on you at some point. So my feeling is risk diversification, such as in financial investment, it applies equally to how we want to run our cooperative in that respect. So I see there's always a role for whole milk powder going offshore or a degree of unfinished product. I absolutely am fully supportive of things like an ingredients business. Perfect. To a business model. But I'd also be very wary about selling off brands and your ability to communicate who you are as an exporter to your end consumer. Because as soon as you can be substituted, you will be substituted. So why make that easy for your competitors and for a business who utilizes your product to substitute you when they want to, whether it's price or convenience? So you need to be able to have a method of exercising market power. And brands, I think, are not a be-all and end-all. They're really hard to establish. They're really hard to maintain, and I get that. But I think they're an important part of a portfolio, and I think they should be maintained to a degree for that reason alone, even if it's just from risk. And we could say, well, it's not our natural thing. We're farmers. We're just really good at putting milk in a vat. That's what we're good at. Let's stick to that. But the reality is that can trip you up.
Yeah.
Just because you're not necessarily naturally good at something doesn't mean you shouldn't develop the skills to be good at something, because that might be the chink in your armour. So why would we not be shoring that up?
Yeah, I think the world market on the milk side of things has probably changed quite a bit, where 10, 20 years ago when Fonterra was first formed, it had the ability to, New Zealand was the low-cost producer globally, right? And you had to export pretty much everything you produced, so you were always there. So you had what you've mentioned, market consistency, and the price figured out because you guys were the best price globally pretty much across the board. So that's really starting to change with production levels becoming more efficient in the U.S. and certain other areas of the world that has gotten that market more competitive. So it's interesting yet there's a change in that that hasn't been there before.
Yeah, I think so. And I think the biggest thing that we probably need to get our head around in the country is that we can't just compete on price. Like we cannot continue to be the lowest cost producer. And I don't want to be the lowest cost producer. It's just there are other people that have a greater comparative advantage in achieving that than we do. We're geographically isolated. Yeah, it's not a huge amount to put food on a ship, but it does cost. It's harder for us to communicate with the world where we're located. And so we just need to be clear about what our game is. And I don't think that just chasing efficiencies the whole way through and trying to produce a widget at the lowest price point, whether it's food or otherwise, is the right natural fit for us. We need to be a little bit smarter than that, I think. Anything else pressing that you'd want to say? No, mate. Look, I think, as much as I love waxing lyrical and giving the world according to Ben Anderson, I think there's a finite amount of Ben Anderson that people can swallow. And so I think it's good to call it there. But look, I just think that sometimes we need to be a bit more audacious and enthusiastic, right? And we need to get out and chase things. Yep. And when we always look at who we are and we look at things from our identity, whether it's a sheep and beef farmer or a dairy farmer or a deer farmer or a forester or a National Party supporter or a Labor Party supporter or a Republican or a Democrat, all those things are inhibitors to our thinking. And we need to be able to be really careful when we start looking at an issue through one of those lenses. That's the biggest thing. We just need to strip that away and be really clear-eyed about where we want to go, what we as a industry want, what our communities need, what our countries need, and how can we tie that in to be as good as we can, right? And there's money there, there's an environment there to be looked after and savoured and enjoyed. We can do all those sort of things, but the world is going to pass us by if we don't be proactive and forward-looking. And I think that's just the biggest thing, is that let's just really look forward with clear eyes and get after it. Yep. And I think if we can do that, then we're doing the best we can, at least. Great. Well, thanks so much, Ben, for allowing me to be here this week and see your beautiful farm and spend some time having other conversations as well as this one. It's great to have you, mate. Always. Yeah, I'm really enjoying it. It's cool to have your family here, and it's just really neat. I met Paul over in Texas a wee while ago now on a Nuffield tour, and I've always enjoyed his insights and his enthusiasm and his way of thinking, and it's really cool to be able to maintain that. So, I really enjoy it. So thank you very much. Awesome. Well, thanks, Ben. All good. All right. Well, thanks for listening to another episode of the AgCulture Podcast. Really appreciate you listening and hope you enjoyed hearing Ben Anderson's story and more about the Hawke's Bay region of the North Island of New Zealand. Tune in next week for another episode of my travels here throughout New Zealand and Australia. They'll keep coming out for several more weeks, so keep listening for that. Keep checking out our social media if you want to see more of the pictures and some of the detailed insights from our travels as well. Once again, I'm Paul Windemaller, and this has been another exciting episode of the AgCulture Podcast. We'll see you next week.